some parties will be remembered for centuries. Indeed, the guest list alone becomes legend. Artists, aristocrats, celebrities, whose presence validated the host's position at the absolute peak of society. Photographers capture the spectacle. Newspapers devote entire sections to describing costumes, menus, the particular species of excess that money enables when taste fails to constrain it. But then comes the morning after. Not the literal morning with its champagne headaches and discarded masks, but the weeks and months that follow when the host discovers that the same event meant to announce their social supremacy has actually destroyed it. The guests they courted now mock them. The society they tried to impress closes ranks against them. And the so-called party of the century that was supposed to cement their legacy becomes the very thing that ends it. Today we take you inside iconic parties that destroyed their hosts more thoroughly than any scandal or bankruptcy ever could. On the night of November 28, 1966, 540 people arrived at the Plaza Hotel in New York City wearing black and white and masks. They came from Hollywood and Washington and London and Rome. They were senators and film stars and novelists and socialites, and in a few cases, the doorman from the plaza itself. The host had been planning the evening since July, carrying a black and white composition notebook wherever he went, adding names and removing them, constructing what he would later call the most perfectly proportioned social event of the century. The host was 5 feet 3 inches tall, weighed roughly 120 pounds, and spoke in a voice that sounded like something borrowed from a southern aunt and never returned. His name was Truman Capote. He was 42 years old, the most famous writer in America, and at the absolute apex of everything he would ever achieve. He knew this. Most people at the party did not know it yet. Truman Streckfus Persons was born on September 30th, 1924, in New Orleans, to parents who were 19 and 17 years old respectively, and wanted almost nothing to do with each other and very little to do with him. His father, Arch Persons, was a salesman who would spend the rest of his life pursuing schemes that came to nothing. His mother, Lily May, was beautiful and restless, and had decided almost immediately that motherhood was not what she had in mind. When Truman was 4 years old and his parents divorced, she left him in Monroeville, Alabama, with a collection of elderly female cousins he would spend the rest of his childhood calling his aunts. The house in Monroeville was large and enclosed by a high rock fence, and presided over by women who smelled of talcum powder and old wood. The cousins were kind in a distracted way, and they left the small, peculiar boy largely to himself. He was delicate in appearance and extraordinary in intelligence, and spent his days reading everything he could find and teaching himself to type on a machine left in the back bedroom. He was also, by his own description, the best-looking child he had ever seen. The confidence was real. It would serve him for decades. The neighbour's daughter was 2 years younger than Truman and named Nelle Harper Lee. She was the daughter of a local lawyer, built like a boy, and capable of producing violence at short notice on behalf of whoever she considered her friends. She became his protector, in the way that only children who recognize each other's strangeness can protect one another. They climbed trees together. They wrote stories together. They stayed friends, intermittently and then permanently, for the rest of their lives. Truman moved to New York in his early teens when his mother remarried a Cuban businessman named Joe Capote, whose surname he adopted. He never attended college. He got a job at the New Yorker carrying mail and talking to anyone who would listen, which was everyone. By the time he was 23 years old, he had published his first novel. Other Voices, Other Rooms appeared in January of 1948 and was discussed with a ferocity usually reserved for political scandals. The photograph on the dust jacket showed Truman reclining on a chaise with an expression that managed to be simultaneously innocent and knowing, and the letters that came in about the photograph were nearly as numerous as the letters that came in about the book. He was openly, conspicuously homosexual in an era that had no framework for what that meant beyond disgrace, and he wore the fact like a piece of couture that only he could afford. New York decided he was a phenomenon and invited him everywhere. Breakfast at Tiffany's, published in 1958, confirmed that the phenomenon had staying power. The character of Holly Golightly was immediately understood to be a version of someone real, and everyone argued about who, which was exactly what Truman intended. He had an instinct, refined throughout his childhood among women who talked and whispered and observed from behind their screens, for the precise amount of truth that makes fiction magnetic. He would use it one more time spectacularly, and it would destroy him. In November of 1959, Truman read a small item in the New York Times. A family of 4 had been murdered in their home in Holcomb, Kansas. The Clutters were well-liked, prosperous, entirely ordinary people, in the way that only certain Kansas families managed to be, and someone had cut their throats and shot them. The item ran to a few hundred words. Truman read it several times and then called his editor and said he was going to Kansas. He took Harper Lee with him. This was a practical decision. Truman, in Holcomb, Kansas, in 1959, with his small body and his affected voice and his tailored coat, was an apparition from a world so foreign that the townspeople did not know what to do with him. Harper Lee was a large, plain, practical Alabaman woman who had grown up 30 miles from where Truman had, and who could talk to anyone. She interviewed for 6 weeks, produced over 150 pages of notes, and largely made the book possible by creating the access Truman needed. The 2 killers, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, were arrested in Las Vegas in late December of 1959 and brought back to Kansas. Truman visited them in prison over the following years with a regularity that required explanation and produced gossip. He was, by his own eventual admission, in love with Perry Smith in a way he never adequately defined and possibly never adequately understood. Smith was dark and compact and had been damaged in ways that Truman, the small boy abandoned by his mother, recognized and responded to. Whether Smith returned the feeling or simply understood that a famous New York writer was a more useful friend than most death row inmates could claim was a question that Truman preferred not to examine. He spent 6 years on it. He befriended the killers, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, with a thoroughness that crossed into something beyond professional interest. When the state of Kansas executed them in April of 1965, Truman was present. He wept. The book was published in January of 1966, had been serialized in The New Yorker, and sold in quantities that no serious literary work had sold in recent memory. Truman Capote became famous the way that very few writers ever become famous, not as a writer, but as a person. He decided to throw a party. The women had been accumulating around him for years. He called them his swans, and the name was accurate in the way that only nicknames given by people who see clearly are accurate. They were beautiful. They moved through the world with a quality of effortlessness that was entirely manufactured at enormous expense and sustained by the kind of discipline that most people mistake for ease. They had married men with money, or in some cases had simply been born with it, and they occupied the upper floors of a social structure that Truman, the boy from Monroeville, had always been able to see from below, and had spent his adult life ascending. Babe Paley was the first among them, and the most important. She was born Barbara Cushing, the daughter of a Boston neurosurgeon, and she had grown up in a family that understood social position with the seriousness that other families reserved for religion. She had married first a Mortimer, and then in 1947 a man named William S. Paley, who had built Columbia Broadcasting System into the most powerful television network in the world. She was known principally for her taste, which was perfect in the way that only a few people in any generation achieve. Truman loved her with a devotion that was entirely sincere and entirely complicated, which is the only way Truman loved anyone. Slim Keith had been born Nancy Gross in California and had constructed herself into something quite different through a combination of good bones and better wit. She had been married to Howard Hawks and Leland Hayward, and eventually a British banker named Kenneth Keith, which gave her a title she used sparingly. She was sharp in the way that women who have survived interesting marriages tend to be sharp, and she and Truman spent hours on the telephone conducting what she later described as the most entertaining conversations of her life. Gloria Guinness had been born in Mexico to a family with no money and had ended up married to Lowell Guinness, who had a great deal of it. The distance between these 2 points represented a journey of strategic precision that Truman found genuinely admirable. She was the most international of the swans, at ease in a way that people who have had to learn ease generally become. Morella Agnelli was Italian and married to the man who ran Fiat, and she and Truman shared a quality of observation so fine that their conversations could be read as collaboration. Lee Radziwill was Jackie Kennedy's younger sister, which guaranteed a level of attention she had spent her life both seeking and resenting. She had married a Polish prince named Stanislaw Radziwill and acquired a title that sounded more substantial than the marriage actually was. Her proximity to power was always defined partly by proximity to her sister, which she navigated with a mixture of grace and effort. Truman appreciated the effort and found the grace instructive. CZ Guest gardened with a seriousness that Truman found puzzling and charming in equal measure. Pamela Churchill Harriman, the most politically connected of the swans, had been married to Winston Churchill's son during the war and had parlayed a series of relationships with powerful men into a position of genuine diplomatic influence. She was a woman who understood, with unusual clarity, that access to powerful men is itself a form of power, and she had used it accordingly. What bound these women together beyond their money and their social position was something more specific. They had each arrived at a point in their lives where almost everyone around them wanted something from them, and very few people were interested in who they actually were. Truman was interested. He asked questions and waited for the answers, and remembered everything and asked follow-up questions weeks later, which is the most flattering thing you can do for a person who is accustomed to being admired but not actually seen. They opened themselves to him accordingly. It was a catastrophic error of judgment, and it was entirely understandable. What they gave him was access. What they gave him beyond that was something rarer: honesty. Women of their position lived surrounded by people who wanted things from them, and Truman wanted things too, but he also genuinely listened, which was unusual enough that the swans found themselves telling him things they had not told anyone else. He was the confessional and the confidant and the entertainer, and for a decade and a half it worked perfectly for everyone. William Paley was a man of considerable accomplishment and considerable appetite. He had built CBS from a Philadelphia radio station into a national empire. He was also, throughout his marriage to Babe, conducting affairs with a frequency and carelessness that suggested he did not expect anyone to notice, or did not particularly care if they did. Babe noticed. She told Truman. The specific information she passed to him over the years of their friendship was extensive. She talked about her husband's behavior with other women. She talked about the particular humiliation of being married to a man the world considered a great catch. She talked about the gap between the life she appeared to lead in the society pages and the life she actually led in the apartments and houses she shared with a man who had very little interest in her feelings. Truman listened and remembered. He always remembered. Their friendship had a quality of mutual dependency that went beyond what either of them would have described in public. She gave him respectability and access. He gave her the experience of being truly known by someone who found her interesting, rather than simply admirable. She had spent her life being admired. It was not the same thing. He confided in her as well, or appeared to. He told her things about himself and about other people that she understood to be confidential. The transaction was mutual. The mistake she made, the mistake they all made, was in not understanding that for Truman, nothing was truly confidential when there was a better story to be told. Truman described the planning of the ball as the most serious artistic project he had undertaken since In Cold Blood, which was not entirely a joke. He sat by the pool at his friend Eleanor Freed's house in July of 1966, and the idea arrived fully formed. A masked ball at the Plaza in black and white, in honor of Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, whose husband had recently taken his own life, and who Truman felt deserved to be cheered up in the grandest possible way. The guest list occupied 3 months. He carried the black and white composition book everywhere. He was on the telephone constantly. He added and removed names with the deliberateness of a general deploying troops, and the deliberateness was not accidental. Every decision on that list was a statement about who mattered and who did not, a declaration of Truman's taste and Truman's power encoded in 430 paper invitations. He invited Frank Sinatra and his then-girlfriend Mia Farrow. He invited Norman Mailer, which required a willingness to manage the chaos that Mailer's presence at any event inevitably produced. He invited Lauren Bacall and Henry Fonda and Candice Bergen. He invited McGeorge Bundy, who had been National Security Advisor to both Kennedy and Johnson. He invited the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who were old, faded, and still capable of causing a room to go silent. He invited Lee Radziwill, who was not Jackie Kennedy, but who would make people think of Jackie Kennedy, which served the same purpose. He invited the doorman of the Plaza Hotel. He did not invite the critics who had reviewed him badly. He did not invite certain actresses he considered insufficiently interesting. He did not invite people who bored him, which was a category that included a surprisingly large portion of New York society. The exclusions became, in their way, as famous as the inclusions. People spent weeks trying to determine whether they were on the list. Some of them were not, and would not forgive it. The preparations in the weeks before the ball had produced a secondary social event as consuming as the ball itself. Women who had received invitations debated their gowns in the way that generals debate strategy. The requirement of black or white narrowed the field, but did not simplify the decision. Within those constraints, every choice of fabric and silhouette and accessory became an argument about who you were and how seriously you were taking this. Women who had not received invitations spent those same weeks in a state of distress that was occasionally comic and occasionally genuine, and the line between the two was never entirely clear. The masks were the detail that separated Truman's event from any ordinary party. He had understood from the beginning that the mask was not a costume accessory, but a structural element. It forced people to look at each other differently. It removed, temporarily, the social shorthand of recognition that normally governs how the very rich and the very powerful interact with one another. Behind a mask, a senator and a doorman occupy the same formal position, and while this equality was brief and theatrical, Truman had judged correctly that even brief theatricality can change the temperature of a room. The guests arrived at the plaza on the evening of November 28th, through crowds of onlookers who had gathered on Fifth Avenue to watch. The dress code had been explicit. Men wore black tie and black masks. Women wore black or white gowns with white masks or fans. The instruction that masks were to remain on until midnight had produced a secondary industry. Adolfo and Holston both designed custom masks for guests willing to spend several $100s on the privilege, while Truman's own mask had cost 39 cents at a drugstore and was paper and rhinestone. The grand ballroom had been decorated with red tablecloths and gold candelabra threaded with smilax vines and white tapers instead of flowers, because the florist Truman had originally engaged had suggested something too elaborate and been dismissed. The band played. The champagne moved in waves through the room. The masks stayed on, which had the intended effect. People talked to each other without the usual social calculations, because behind a mask it was briefly possible to forget who you were supposed to be and simply be interested. Truman moved through the room receiving tribute with the precision of a head of state who has waited a very long time for the appropriate ceremony. He danced with Katharine Graham, in whose honour the evening was ostensibly held, and with Babe Paley, and with Mia Farrow, and with people who would spend the rest of their lives describing the moment. At midnight, the masks came off. By the time the last guests left at 4 a.m, an understanding had settled over New York society. There was no one more socially powerful in the city than the small man with the composition notebook. He had organized the century's best party, and he had done it with a guest list that was, by consensus, perfect. It was the last perfect thing he would do. The reviews in the following days were effusive in a way that suggested people had been waiting for something to be effusive about. The New York Times and Women's Wear Daily and the society pages of newspapers in 3 countries treated the ball as a cultural event rather than a party. Truman was photographed everywhere. He gave interviews in which his comments about who had and had not been invited were reported as social criticism. The position he occupied in the months after the ball was unusual and precarious in a way that he did not recognize. and that his friends recognized but could not adequately convey to him. He was at the summit of a particular kind of American social achievement that has no formal name. The gay man of modest origins who has become so skilled at the performance of social grace that the people he performs for genuinely believe he is one of them. The swans believed he was one of them. The mistake was understandable. He had worked very hard to make it. The party had been, among other things, a demonstration of something that the New York of 1966 was still working out, that social power and cultural power and financial power were not the same thing and did not always travel together, and that a man with none of the third and the first only on loan from his friends could, through sheer force of personality and intelligence, exercise the second absolutely. Truman had invited the president's national security advisor and a Kansas farm wife to the same party and seated them in adjacent rooms, and both had come, which told you something about what he had become. The question that nobody asked at the time, or not loudly enough for him to hear it, was what he was going to do next. The ball was a summit, and summits by their nature are followed by descents. The friendships and the invitations and the access were predicated on continued performance, on the ongoing production of the wit and the gossip, and the literary reputation that justified the swan's investment of time and trust. He had been performing for 20 years. The performance required material. The material was what the swans had given him. He was also, simultaneously, a serious writer who had not written a serious book in years, and had contracted to deliver one. The publisher Random House had a manuscript due. The advance had been generous. The title was Answered Prayers. Truman had told everyone who would listen that it would be his Proustian novel, his life's work, his summation of everything he had seen and heard in 20 years of living among the most interesting people in America. The contract with Random House had been signed in 1966, the same year as the ball, with a delivery date of January 1st, 1968. Truman missed it. He renegotiated. He missed the next deadline. He renegotiated again. By the time the amount he had received in advances reached $1 million, he had produced fragments of chapters and an extraordinary volume of explanation for why the chapters were not yet complete. The truth, which he did not entirely admit to himself, and certainly did not admit to his publishers, was that the book he was writing required him to use material that could not be published without destroying the relationships that had provided it. The swans had given him the raw material of answered prayers, their secrets, their humiliations, their private assessments of their husbands and each other. He had transcribed them, barely disguised, into fiction. He knew what would happen when it appeared. He kept writing. There was also a simpler problem. In Cold Blood had been possible because Truman had embedded himself in a Kansas community that had no power over his literary career or his social life. The subjects of answered prayers were not Kansas farm wives. They were the women who invited him to their houses in Southampton and Palm Beach and the south of France. He had to finish the book and live among these women simultaneously, which produced a paralysis that he addressed by drinking and appearing on television and explaining to interviewers that the work was going brilliantly. The story he carried most carefully, the one that had been passed to him under specific conditions of confidentiality, involved a woman named Anne Woodward. She was not one of the swans. She was, in the view of New York society of the 1950s, precisely the kind of woman the swans had been constructed to exclude. Anne Woodward had been born in Kansas and had come to New York and become a showgirl and a model, and eventually, in 1943, the wife of William Woodward Jr., who was the heir to a banking fortune and a stable of racehorses, and everything that his family had decided he should not waste on someone like Anne. The Woodward family received her with a coldness that the society pages recorded and everyone understood. She was tolerated because the marriage was legal. She was not accepted. On October 30th, 1955, the night after a dinner party in their home in Oyster Bay, Anne Woodward shot and killed her husband in a darkened hallway. She told police she had heard a prowler. A man named Paul Wirtz had indeed been on the property that night and was arrested. The grand jury returned a verdict of accidental death. Anne Woodward was legally innocent, Legally innocent was not the same as socially innocent, and New York society understood the difference. She was finished. She spent the years that followed in Europe, drifting through the cities where people who have been expelled from one world try to construct a smaller version of it. William Paley had known Billy Woodward well. He had told his wife Babe what he thought had actually happened. Babe had told Truman. Esquire magazine published the first excerpt from Answered Prayers in its November 1975 issue. The chapter was called La Côte Basque, 1965, named for a fashionable French restaurant on East 55th Street, where Truman had spent many lunches listening and observing. The chapter was narrated by a character named P.B. Jones, who was understood immediately to be Truman. At a corner table at La Côte Basque, Jones encounters a woman named Lady Ina Coolberth, who is understood immediately to be Slim Keith. Over lunch, the women at surrounding tables talk. A character named Anne Hopkins tells the story of how she shot her husband in a darkened hallway, believing him to be a prowler. Anne Hopkins was understood immediately to be Anne Woodward. A character named Sidney Dillon, married to a woman named Cleo, appears in the chapter in a story involving a sexual encounter with the wife of a state governor, conducted in circumstances of some squalor. Sidney Dillon was understood immediately to be William S. Paley. Cleo Dillon was understood immediately to be Babe Paley. The story about the governor's wife was understood immediately to be one of William Paley's actual affairs, told to Truman in confidence by Babe, transformed into fiction with a thinness of disguise that amounted to a dare. New York received the chapter the way cities receive catastrophic weather. First disbelief, then assessment of damage, then a long period of reckoning. The phones ran hot for weeks. Every person mentioned in the chapter, and every person who knew a person mentioned in the chapter, had an opinion about what Truman had done and why. Gloria Vanderbilt announced that the next time she saw Truman Capote, she was going to spit in his face. Anne Woodward had learned, before the issue appeared on newsstands, that she was in it. She was living in Paris. She obtained a copy and read it. On October 9, 1975, she swallowed a cyanide pill and died in her apartment. Billy Woodward's mother, Elsie Woodward, was in her 90s and had spent 20 years maintaining a position on her daughter-in-law's guilt that she had never expressed publicly but had never doubted privately. When she received word of Anne Woodward's death, she is reported to have said, "She shot my son and Truman just murdered her." The sentence contains everything. It acknowledges without ambiguity what Elsie Woodward believed about the shooting in Oyster Bay. It acknowledges without ambiguity what the publication of La Côte Basque had done to a woman who had no remaining social protection. And it names, precisely and permanently, what Truman had done. Not written about, not fictionalized, murdered. Truman's response to the news of Anne Woodward's death was recorded by several people in his circle. He said very little. The woman had not been his friend. He had known the story second-hand. What he appears to have understood by October of 1975 was that the calculation he had made about the consequences of publishing the chapter had been catastrophically wrong. He had told people who warned him about the reactions of the swans, "They are too dumb. They will not know who they are. They knew exactly who they were." Babe Paley did not speak to Truman Capote again. This was the sentence that mattered most, out of all the silences that followed publication of the chapter. The others stung. Slim Keith consulted a lawyer about a libel suit and decided not to pursue it, and simply stopped answering the telephone when it was Truman. Gloria Guinness withdrew from the friendship with a completeness that suggested she had been waiting for a reason. Morella Agnelli, the most restrained of the swans, simply became unavailable in all the ways that a woman with several houses and a full social calendar can become unavailable without ever saying a definitive word. Babe's silence was different, because Babe's relationship had been different. She had told him things about her marriage to William Paley that she had not told anyone else in the world. The fictional Sidney Dillon's encounter with the governor's wife was not Truman's invention. It was Babe's information, carried out of the privacy of her marriage and placed on the page of a magazine sold at newsstands. She had trusted him with the specific, documented humiliation of her adult life, and he had published it. Truman initially characterized the reactions as misguided. He told Dick Cavett that he had not expected anyone to be annoyed unless they had been left out. He told a journalist that the characters were fictional and the connections being drawn were the work of people with too much imagination and too little to do. In his apartment at United Nations Plaza, he reportedly wept and repeated the same sentence to the person who was with him. "I did not mean to. I thought they would come back. They did not come back." The social structure that had sustained him for 15 years, the party invitations and the houses and the long lunches and the telephone calls, collapsed over the course of a few months into a silence that was total. He had been Truman Capote, the most entertaining man in the room. He became, overnight, Judas in tweeds. In 1977, Babe Paley was diagnosed with lung cancer. She was 60 years old, had smoked for most of her adult life, and the diagnosis meant that the silence between her and Truman was running out of time in which to be maintained. He tried to reach her. He wrote letters. He called people who might carry a message. He wanted, by every account, to speak to her before she died. She did not respond. William Paley, whose infidelities had been anatomized in the pages of Esquire for the reading public, had no interest in facilitating a reconciliation. The friends who might have served as intermediaries had largely taken sides in the way that social circles, once disrupted, tend to calcify around the lines of division. Babe's side had more people on it. She died on July 2, 1978. She was 63 years old. Truman was not present. He was not invited to the funeral. He did not write publicly about her death, which was unusual for a man who had written publicly about almost everything that had ever happened to him. The people who knew him well understood the silence as a form of grief that had no adequate public expression. She had been the person he loved most. He had used what she told him in a way that made the love indistinguishable from betrayal. Whether he had intended this outcome was, by July of 1978, an irrelevant question. She was gone, and the silence was permanent, and he had no one to blame except the writer in him that had always found the story more important than the person who provided it. The years between the publication of La Côte Basque and Truman's death stretched across 9 years of diminishment. He drank. He took pills. He appeared on talk shows in conditions that prompted concern from audiences and embarrassment from hosts. He was on The Tonight Show and various other programs in states that his friends described as performances and his enemies described as collapse, and in retrospect the distinction was less clear than it seemed at the time. He had a relationship with a man named John O'Shea that was, by the accounts of people who witnessed it, damaging in the specific way that relationships between alcoholics and the people who enable them tend to be damaging. His long-term partner, Jack Dunphy, who had been with him since 1948, and who was a writer of genuine quality and quiet disposition, remained technically present in his life while practically absent, which was a reasonable response to what Truman had become. He continued to claim, to publishers and journalists and anyone who would listen, that Answered Prayers was nearly finished. It was not nearly finished. It had not been nearly finished for years. The $1 million advance from Random House represented a contract with a deadline of March 1st, 1981, which he did not meet, producing another renegotiation and another deadline and another period of explanation. Whether the manuscript existed in any complete form became, over the course of these years, genuinely uncertain. The television appearances of the late 1970s and early 80s are difficult to watch now, partly because they are genuinely distressing, and partly because you can still see, beneath the distress, the performer who had once made a room of 500 people feel that they were exactly where the world was most alive. The intelligence was still there, the observation was still there, the wit emerged in flashes that made the surrounding incoherence more painful by contrast. He was a man trying to perform a version of himself that required a stability he no longer possessed, and the gap between the performance and the reality was visible in the way that certain kinds of damage are visible. Not all at once, but in accumulation, one appearance after another. He was arrested for drunk driving in Southampton in 1977. He attended rehabilitation programs. He emerged from them and drank again. He appeared on talk shows, looking like a diminished version of himself. The performance of Truman Capote, which had been so brilliant and so sustained for so long, was breaking down in public, in real time, in front of audiences who were not always sure whether they were watching a tragedy or something else. On August 25, 1984, Truman Capote died in Bel Air, California, at the home of Joanne Carson, who had been the second wife of Johnny Carson and had remained one of the small number of people who had not abandoned him in the years after the publication of Answered Prayers. He was 59 years old. The official cause of death was liver disease complicated by phlebitis and the presence of multiple drugs in his system. He had been in failing health for years. He died in a bed that was not his own, in a city that was not really his, attended by a friend who had stuck around partly out of loyalty and partly because she was one of the few people left who would. Jack Dunphy received word of his death in New York, where he had been living separately but remained Truman's designated heir and the executor of his estate. The two men had been together in one form or another for 36 years. Dunphy wrote a memoir called Dear Genius, published 3 years after Truman's death, which was the most honest document anyone close to Truman ever produced about what it had been like to be close to him. The manuscript of Answered Prayers was never found. Whether it had been destroyed intentionally, lost in the course of a life conducted across too many apartments and houses, or never truly completed beyond what had already appeared in Esquire, was a question that remained open and was never answered. 3 chapters appeared posthumously, assembled from what existed. They are good in the specific way that Truman's best work was always good, immediate, precise, and devastating in the accuracy of their social observation. They are also unfinished in a way that is hard to read without grief, because you can see what the completed novel would have been and understand precisely what was lost. Truman Capote left 2 perfect books and 1 unfinished one. He left a party that is still described as the finest private social event of the 20th century. He left a literary estate that generated significant royalties and a cultural presence that continued to grow in the decades after his death, partly because the story of the swans and their betrayal was precisely the kind of story that each generation rediscovers and finds immediately compelling. He left behind women who had built walls around what had happened to them and maintained those walls with a consistency that was itself a kind of tribute to what he had done. Slim Keith wrote her memoirs and discussed the friendship and the betrayal without warmth but without excessive bitterness, which was perhaps the most honest response available to her. Lee Radziwill lived long enough to see the story dramatized in ways she declined to comment on. CZ Guest died in 2003, having never publicly forgiven him and never publicly accused him of anything worse than poor judgment. Babe Paley's daughter, Amanda Burden, said in later years that her mother had loved Truman and that the love had been real and that the betrayal had also been real and that these 2 things existed simultaneously in a way that could not be resolved. This is probably the most accurate description available of what the friendship had been and what its ending had meant. Princess Yasmin Aga Khan, who was the daughter of Rita Hayworth and Prince Ali Khan, once observed that the cruelest thing you can do to someone who trusts you is to prove that their trust was misplaced. She was not speaking about Truman Capote, but she could have been. The boy from Monroeville had wanted, above everything else, to be one of the people in the room. He had achieved it, fully and permanently, through talent and charm and work, and the systematic cultivation of women who had no reason to distrust him. And then he had taken what they gave him and put it in a magazine and watched the room empty. He had always said that writing was the only thing he could do and the only thing he truly wanted to do. In 1975, when the choice between the writer and the friend had become unavoidable, he chose the writer. The writer did not finish the book. The only question worth asking at this distance is whether he knew, when he sat down to write La Côte Basque, that Babe would not come back. Whether he understood that the publication would be permanent, and that Babe's silence would be permanent, and that he was choosing the paragraph over the person. The people who knew him best could not agree on the answer. Some believed he had no idea what he was unleashing. Others believed he understood exactly. The women who had given Truman Capote the material for the most scandalous literary work of the decade did not simply disappear when he died. Babe Paley was gone by 1978. But the others lived on for years, some of them for decades, carrying the friendship and the betrayal through marriages and divorces and deaths and reinventions that Capote never lived to see. This is what happened to the Swans when the party was finally completely over. Nancy Keith, known to everyone who mattered as Slim, did not produce her reaction to La Côte Basque in letters or interviews. She produced it eventually in 400 pages. Her memoir, Slim, Memories of a Rich and Imperfect Life, was published in 1990 with a co-author named Annette Tappert and serialized in Vanity Fair before Slim herself died. She did not live to read the reviews. The memoir contains the most precise account any Swan ever offered of what the friendship had actually been. She describes Capote telling her in one of their telephone conversations that he acted campy and performed himself for people so that they would be laughing with him rather than at him. She had replied at the time, "No, we love you." On the page, decades later, she leaves the exchange without comment. The gap between what she had said in the moment and what she understood when she wrote it down says more than any explicit verdict could. The question of whether Slim had been the real Lady Coolberth in La Côte Basque was debated from the moment the issue appeared on newsstands. Some scholars believed the character was Pamela Harriman, whose social history more closely matched certain details in the text. Others believed it was a composite. Slim herself believed it was her, which was the only interpretation that mattered for the purposes of their friendship. She had read the story and recognized herself and never spoken to Capote again, and the certainty she felt about the identification was itself a piece of evidence, since people tend to recognize themselves most clearly in portraits that capture something true. Slim Keith died on April 16, 1990, at the age of 72. She had spent her post-Capote decades between New York and London, maintaining the social position she had built through 4 marriages and a talent for friendship that was, by the time she died, entirely unimpaired. She had outlived Howard Hawks. She had outlived Leland Hayward, whom she described as the great love of her life. She had outlived Truman Capote by 6 years. The memoir was the last word, and she had chosen it carefully. Of all the women in Capote's orbit, Pamela Churchill Harriman had perhaps the most remarkable second act. She had already had a first act that required some explaining. The daughter of an English baron, she had been married briefly during the war to Randolph Churchill, and had conducted wartime affairs in London that became so well known they were considered a form of intelligence work. After the war, she had moved through marriages and relationships with some of the most powerful men in Europe and America before landing in 1971 on Averell Harriman, the railroad heir and diplomat who was 31 years her senior and worth considerably more than most of the others combined. After La Côte Basque, Pamela Harriman became a different kind of figure. Some scholars argued that she, not Slim Keith, was the real model for the unflattering Lady Coolberth in the story. She did not comment publicly on the matter. What she did instead was transform herself into the most effective Democratic Party fundraiser in America. In 1980, she founded an organization called Democrats for the 80s, which became known informally as PAMPAC, and over the following years raised $12 million for the party. She organized dinner parties in Washington that functioned as policy seminars and talent showcases simultaneously. Jimmy Carter benefited, Walter Mondale benefited, Bill Clinton benefited perhaps most of all. Averell Harriman died in 1986, leaving her the houses and the fortune and the social position in Washington that she had spent 15 years acquiring. In 1993, President Clinton appointed her United States ambassador to France. She moved to the American Embassy in Paris, hosted the most sought-after dinners in the diplomatic quarter, and occupied a position of genuine influence in Franco-American relations at the precise moment when both countries were trying to figure out what the post-Cold War world required of them. The American Embassy in Paris under Pamela Harriman became one of the social centres of the city. She entertained with the instincts she had spent 60 years developing, understanding that a dinner table where the right people were placed in the right proximity to each other was a foreign policy instrument, as effective as any formal communiqué. She spoke French with genuine fluency and moved through Parisian society with an ease that American diplomats rarely achieved, because she had been arriving in European drawing rooms since the 1940s and had never entirely left them. What she had never done, publicly, was address her place in answered prayers. If she was the model for Lady Coolberth, she had absorbed the identification without comment and redirected her energy into becoming something that no fictional character could match. The woman in the story was a socialite of fading consequence. The woman in the actual world became a senator's widow, a party chairman, an ambassador, and one of the most consequential political operatives of her generation. It was, by any measure, the better outcome. She died on January 5, 1997, at the age of 76. The cause was a brain hemorrhage. She had been swimming in the pool at the Ritz Hotel in Paris earlier that day. The woman who had been introduced to Truman Capote at a party in the 1950s, whose social life had been mapped and dissected in his fiction, ended her days as an ambassador of the United States, representing the country she had adopted to the country where she died, in a hotel where Proust had once lived, and where the bar still served a particular champagne cocktail she had preferred. Lee Bouvier Radziwill spent more than 40 years after the publication of La Côte Basque, and during those years she tried, with varying success, most of the things that wealthy women of her background tried in the 1970s and beyond. She opened an interior design business in 1976, secured a contract to design suites for a hotel chain, and was featured in Architectural Digest. The business did not survive its first decade. She attempted an acting career, appearing in a production of the Philadelphia Story in 1967, 2 years before the ball, which Capote himself had coached her through. She appeared in the television miniseries The Winds of War in 1983. Neither career became what she had hoped. What did become central to her later life was fashion, in the way that fashion becomes central to women who have always understood it as a form of self-construction. She worked as a style counselor to Giorgio Armani, maintained apartments in Paris and London, and eventually New York's Upper East Side, and was photographed regularly in the company of people who found her social history romantic and her aesthetic sensibility instructive. Her sister, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, died in May of 1994. Lee outlived her by 25 years, which meant she outlived Jackie, outlived Capote, outlived Slim Keith, outlived Babe Paley, outlived almost everyone from the world that Capote had captured and destroyed in a single magazine issue. Her son, Anthony Radziwill, died of cancer in August of 1999, weeks after his cousin John F. Kennedy Jr. died in a plane crash over the Atlantic. The losses accumulated with the specific cruelty that comes to people who live long enough to bury the generation below them as well as their own. In the years before her death, Lee Radziwill gave occasional interviews in which she discussed Capote with a measured distance that suggested time had done its work. She remembered him as brilliant, as funny, as a person who had understood her in ways that other people had not. She did not forgive the betrayal explicitly. She did not condemn it with the same heat that had marked the years immediately after publication. She had simply lived past it, the way you live past a room that was once important and is now just somewhere you used to go. There was a particular irony in Lee Radziwill's relationship to Capote's memory that she seemed to understand. He had coached her through the acting role she had attempted in 1967, spending weeks on the telephone with her as she prepared for the Philadelphia Story in Chicago, advising her on delivery and presence and how to hold the audience's attention, which was something he knew about from extensive personal experience. The role had not gone well. The critics had been kind in the way that critics are kind when they want to be honest, but do not feel they can. Capote had not made her an actress. He had simply been present for the attempt, in the way he was present for all the things his swans tried to do that did not quite work, offering encouragement with the genuine warmth that made him indispensable to them, and the sharp eye that noticed everything they preferred he would not. When the FX series about the betrayal was broadcast in 2024, Callista Flockhart played Lee Radziwill. Lee had been dead for 5 years by then. The actress who played her was working from interviews and photographs, and the written record of a woman who had spent her adult life being the second most famous person in every room she entered, always standing slightly to the left of her sister's extraordinary gravity, and who had found in Truman Capote someone who thought she was interesting in her own right. Whatever his other failings, he had given her that. She died on February 15th, 2019, in her Upper East Side apartment. She was 85 years old. Cornelia Guest, known since her debutante years as CZ, addressed the problem of what to do after Capote in the most literal possible way. She went into the garden. Her Palm Beach estate, a property called Villa Artemis, became over the following decades one of the most written about private gardens in America. She published books on gardening. She appeared in magazines, sitting among her own flowers, with a practicality that made her seem less like a socialite who had found a hobby and more like a gardener who happened to have a famous address. Andy Warhol photographed her extensively throughout the 1970s and 80s, producing portraits that captured something that the society photographs of the 50s and 60s had missed. A woman who was genuinely comfortable with herself in a way that her set very rarely managed to be. She attended his factory gatherings and his parties with the same ease she brought to Palm Beach, and the horse shows she judged, and the various committees she sat on, with the thoroughness of someone who considered social obligation a serious form of work. Her daughter Cornelia became a socialite and model of the next generation, known more for her fashion appearances than for any inherited estate, which was its own kind of commentary on what the world had become. The Warhol friendship deserves a moment. He photographed CZ throughout the 1970s and 80s, and the portraits he produced captured something that her social peers rarely allowed to be captured: genuine relaxation. Most of the women Capote knew presented themselves with a degree of armour that was invisible until you saw a photograph where someone had managed to photograph them without it. Warhol had a talent for that, and CZ apparently trusted him in the way that she had once trusted Capote, which was the trust of a person who understood they were being observed and did not particularly mind. She had known Capote before the ball and after the publication, and had simply continued to know herself, which is the rarest and most useful quality available to a person navigating a social world that is always on the verge of collapse. The garden was not a retreat, it was an assertion. This is what I do, and I do it well, and the rest of the noise is exactly that. CZ Guest died on November 8, 2003 in Palm Beach at the age of 83. She had spent 43 years after the ball doing exactly what she wanted to do, which was not nothing. Morella Agnelli was the most European of the swans and the most private. She had been born in Naples, married into the Agnelli dynasty that controlled fiat and therefore controlled a significant portion of Italian economic life, and had spent her adult years moving between the Agnelli houses in Turin and Villa Perosa, and the boat and the various residences that came with being married to one of the most powerful men in post-war Italy. When Gianni Agnelli died in January of 2003, she had been with him for more than 50 years. She outlived him by 16 years. She published books on Italian gardens that were received as authoritative documents of a particular kind of private beauty that most people would never see in person. She gave interviews in which she discussed design and architecture and the vanishing world of a certain European upper class with the thoughtfulness of someone who had watched it disappear from inside. She did not, by most accounts, discuss Truman Capote frequently. Morella Agnelli died on February 3, 2019. She was 91 years old. The coincidence was the kind that a fiction writer would have removed for being too neat. Morella Agnelli died on February 3, 2019. Lee Radziwill died on February 15, 2019. 12 days separated them. They had been at the ball together in 1966, had known Capote in the years when knowing Capote was the most socially consequential friendship available to a woman of their position, and had lived through the betrayal and the ostracism and the decades of distance, and had died in the same winter month more than half a century later. Nobody had written a news story connecting them at the time. They had occupied different countries, different social worlds, different decades of widowhood and reinvention. Morella had been in Turin. Lee had been on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The fact that they had both been at the Plaza Hotel in 1966, both wearing black or white and masks, both in conversation with the man who would later use their confidences as material, was a biographical detail rather than a living bond by the time they died. And yet the closeness of the timing felt, from the outside, like something. Not supernatural, not meaningful in any mystical sense, but structurally resonant in the way that history occasionally produces endings that seem to have been arranged. The world of the swans had been Truman Capote's great subject and his great failure. The last of them left it in the same month, in the same year, as if the story had finally decided it was time to close. The last of the original swans to leave was not Babe Paley in 1978, who had started the chain of departures. It was two women dying 12 days apart in a February that nobody had marked on any calendar as significant, and international competition that had transformed the automotive industry beyond recognition. Morella was not at the centre of those disputes. She occupied the margins of the family drama in the way that the wives of great men often occupy the margins of their husbands' posthumous complications, present and peripheral simultaneously. She gave interviews over her final years in which she discussed design with the authority of someone who had lived in beautiful spaces for 8 decades and understood what made them work. She discussed Gianni with the equanimity of a woman who had been married to a man of enormous appetites and complicated fidelities, and had decided long ago what the terms of the arrangement were. She did not, in the interviews available to record, discuss Truman Capote. Perhaps there was nothing to add that the silence did not already say. She had been at the ball. She had been in his circle. She had watched what happened and drawn her conclusions and gone on living in the specific way that Italian aristocratic women of her generation went on living, with a discipline and a beauty, and a refusal to be defined by other people's narratives that was itself a form of reply. Of all the women in Capote's circle, Gloria Guinness left the smallest documentary record of what she thought and felt about the betrayal. She had been born in Mexico in 1912, the daughter of a family with nothing, and had constructed herself, through marriages and relationships and an instinct for beautiful objects and beautiful places, into one of the most admired women in Europe. She had ended up with Lowell Guinness, the banker and aviation entrepreneur, and had spent her middle years between Paris and Mexico and the yachts that served as the primary social venue for the kind of international wealth she moved among. The last years of her life were spent largely between Marbella and Paris, in the company of the small circle of people who had known her long enough to accept the conditions under which she allowed herself to be known. She had been born with nothing and had constructed everything, and the construction required maintenance that casual acquaintance could not provide. She dressed in Balenciaga and was considered one of his most devoted clients. She had the kind of relationship with a designer that is only available to women who understand clothing as a form of argument, each piece a position taken, each appearance a statement of terms. What she had thought about answered prayers, about the specific transaction it represented between a man she had trusted and the world he had shared her with, is not recorded with any precision. She was not a woman who made her interior life available for documentation. The 5 years between publication and her death were quiet in the way that the lives of reclusive, wealthy women are quiet, full of things happening, none of them narrated. She died on September 18, 1980, in Paris. She was 67 years old. She had lived only 5 years after the publication of La Côte Basque, which meant she died knowing exactly what Capote had done, and without the benefit of the distance that time eventually provides to people who stay alive long enough to receive it. What she had said to him in the years between, if anything, was not recorded. She had been reclusive in the specific way of women who have constructed themselves carefully and understand that extended exposure is a threat to the construction. Truman Capote died in 1984. The swans outlived him, most of them significantly, and the story outlived the swans. In 2005, a film called Capote examined the years of the in-cold blood research with Philip Seymour Hoffman in the title role. The following year, A separate film called Infamous covered the same period with Toby Jones. Both were received as serious work. Neither touched the Lacote-Basque affair with the same depth that the story deserved. In 2024, the streaming series Feud, Capote versus the Swans dramatised the betrayal and its aftermath with Tom Hollander as Capote and a cast that included Naomi Watts as Babe Paley, Demi Moore as Anne Woodward, and Callista Flockhart as Lee Radziwill. The series was reviewed as stylish, emotionally acute, and sometimes speculative in ways that the historical record did not support, which is the standard problem with dramatisations of recent events involving people whose families are still alive. The Feud series was produced by Ryan Murphy and ran 8 episodes on FX in 2024. Tom Hollander's portrayal of Capote was praised for its physical precision and its sense of the man's fundamental loneliness, the way he had constructed the most glamorous social life of his era, precisely because he needed it more than anyone in it needed him. Naomi Watts played Babe Paley as a woman of almost unbearable elegance and quiet devastation, which was probably accurate. Demi Moore's Anne Woodward appeared briefly but memorably, and the episode depicting the publication of Lacote-Basque was reportedly one of the most discussed episodes of the season. Critics who had access to the historical record noted the series' liberties. Some of the dialogue it put in the swans' mouths was invented. Some of the chronology was compressed. Some of the emotions were amplified for dramatic effect in ways that the actual record, careful and understated, in the way that people who have been publicly humiliated tend to be, did not support. This is always the situation with dramatizations of events that happen to real people who left real documents. The dramatization is always slightly too large, slightly too loud, slightly too certain about things that the record leaves ambiguous. It does not make the core of the story any less true. What the dramatizations confirmed, whatever their individual accuracy, was that the story had not lost its power to compel people who had not been there. The images remained. The grand ballroom of the Plaza in November of '66. 540 people in black and white and masks, at the summit of a world that would not last much longer. On the night of December 12th, 1972, guests drove through dark woodland east of Paris and emerged from the tree line to find a palace on fire. Or so it appeared. The entire facade of Château de Ferrières, 150 feet of neo-Renaissance stone, the largest private house in France, was bathed in shifting orange and red-gold floodlights, engineered with sufficient precision that the illusion held for the length of the forest road. The palace appeared to be burning. On a cold December night, with no sound except tyres on gravel and the faint suggestion of music from somewhere inside, the effect was exactly what the hostess intended. A signal, delivered before anyone had stepped from their car, that the ordinary rules of social life had been suspended for the evening. The hunting hounds had been released onto the grounds to discourage photographers. The invitation, which guests had been required to hold up to a mirror to read because it had been printed in reverse, had specified black tie, long dresses and surrealist heads. Every guest was expected to arrive not merely dressed up, but transformed, their heads replaced or obscured by elaborate sculptural constructions. The guests themselves were to become the artwork. The party was to be not merely a party, but a living exhibition, a dinner theatre, a collective hallucination staged by one of the wealthiest families in Europe and attended by approximately 150 of their closest friends. The hosts were Baron Guy de Rothschild and Baroness Marie-Hélène de Rothschild. The event was the Surrealist Dinner of Heads, and it would become the most legendary private party of the 20th century. Château de Ferrières was not built to be modest, it was built to be impossible. The property was originally purchased in 1829 by Baron James de Rothschild from the heirs of Joseph Fouché, Napoleon's Minister of Police, a man whose private papers had made him the most feared figure in France. James purchased the land and sat on it for 3 decades. Then, in the late 1850s, he summoned the English architect Joseph Paxton, who had already achieved international fame designing the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition of 1851. and gave him an instruction of extraordinary confidence. Paxton had recently completed Mentmore Towers in Buckinghamshire for James's nephew, Marie-Hélène de Rothschild. James had seen it. James was not impressed by what he had seen. "Build me a Mentmore," James told Paxton, "but twice the size." Paxton delivered. The resulting neo-Renaissance palace, completed in 1859 at a cost estimated at several million francs, featured a showpiece central hall 120 feet long and 60 feet high, topped by a full-glass skylight that flooded the room with natural light by day and was lit by gaslight chandeliers by night. The interior atlas columns and caryatids were sculpted by Charles-Henri Joseph Cordier. The decorative painting was supervised by Eugène Lamy. The chateau contained over 80 guest suites, a library of more than 8,000 volumes, accommodation for 100 servants, and stables for 80 horses. The kitchen was housed in a separate building, and an underground railway was constructed to convey hot food to the dining room without it cooling in transit. The surrounding estate covered roughly 4,000 hectares of forest, approximately 30 square kilometres, making it ideal for shooting parties and, as it would turn out, for releasing hunting dogs on photographers. Ferrières was inaugurated on December 16, 1862, with a gala attended by Emperor Napoleon III himself, a mark of social prestige so significant that it effectively established the Rothschilds as the preeminent hosts in France. The evening was reported breathlessly across the European press, establishing Ferrières not merely as a private house, but as a social institution, a place where power gathered to display itself. The family's hospitality became so legendary that when Otto von Bismarck served as Prussian ambassador to Paris during the 1860s, he stayed at Ferrières on multiple occasions, enjoying the estate's comforts so thoroughly that he developed what contemporaries described as a genuine attachment to the place. The attachment proved consequential. When the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870 and Bismarck needed a headquarters from which to direct the siege of Paris, he chose Ferrières, in large part, according to accounts of the time, because he already knew exactly how comfortable it was. The family that had built the chateau was forced to watch their home serve as a Prussian military command post. The chateau was seized again by the Germans during the Second World War. Its art was looted, its rooms stripped, its grounds used by the occupying forces without ceremony. After liberation, it sat empty and neglected for years, its rooms dusty and its formal gardens overgrown. In 1959, the newly married Guy and Marie-Hélène de Rothschild decided to reopen it. What had been a palace of extraordinary hospitality, then a military headquarters, then a ruin of sorts, would now become something it had never quite been before: a stage. The person who made that transformation possible was the Rothschild by birth. Guy Edouard Alphonse Paul de Rothschild was born in Paris on May 21, 1909, the son of Baron Edouard de Rothschild and Germaine Alice Halphen. He was a great-great-grandson of Meyer Amschel Rothschild, the Frankfurt patriarch who had founded the dynasty's banking empire in the 18th century from a single shop on the Judengasse, the Jewish lane of Frankfurt, and built it into the most powerful private financial institution in the world. Half of Guy's great-grandparents were Rothschilds. The blood ran deep. He grew up between two worlds, the family's Paris townhouse on the corner of the Rue de Rivoli and the Place de la Concorde, a property once occupied by Talleyrand, now the United States Embassy, and at Château de Ferrières itself, where the scale of inherited wealth was expressed in every room and every garden. He was educated at the elite Lycée Condorcet and Lycée Louis le Grand, was trained in cavalry at the École de Cavalerie at Saumur, and played golf for France at the international level. When war came, Guy enlisted in the French army and served as a company commander in the 3rd Light Mechanized Division during the Battle of France in 1940. After fighting the Nazis at Carvin, he was part of the retreat to Dunkirk, where he was awarded the Croix de Guerre for bravery on the beaches. He was evacuated to England, immediately returned to France, and eventually fled again through Spain and Portugal to rejoin his parents in New York, after the Vichy regime stripped the family of their French nationality, their Légion d'honneur, and forced the sale of their possessions. He joined the Free French forces and survived the torpedoing and sinking of his transport ship, the Pacific Grove, in March 1943, spending 12 hours in the Atlantic before rescue, before eventually joining General Koenig's staff at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force near Portsmouth. After liberation, Guy returned to the family bank's offices at Rue Lafitte in Paris in 1944. On his father Edouard's death in 1949, he took formal control of the family business and modernized it from a private wealth management shop into an expansive modern bank, Bank Rothschild, serving as its chairman from 1967 to 1979. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine in December 1963. One of his more consequential decisions was recruiting a young teacher named Georges Pompidou to work at the bank in 1953. Pompidou rose to become the bank's general manager, and later, of course, the President of France. Guy was also a renowned thoroughbred breeder whose horse Exbury won the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe in 1963. He inherited Jan Vermeer's The Astronomer, which the Nazis had confiscated during the war. It was returned in 1945 and later acquired by the Louvre in 1983. He was inducted into the International Best Dressed List Hall of Fame in 1985. Then came 1981, and everything changed. The newly elected socialist president François Mitterrand nationalised Banque Rothschild, along with most of France's private banking sector. Guy was devastated. In a front-page open letter to Le Monde, he wrote, "Juif sous Pétain, paria sous Mitterrand, cela suffit. A Jew under Pétain, a paria under Mitterrand, that's enough." He moved temporarily to New York. "Nationalising us meant throwing the Rothschilds out of France," he told the press. "We are a family, not an impersonal corporation." The family that had defined French financial aristocracy for 150 years was, overnight, severed from its institutional base. His son David and nephew Eric later rebuilt, founding Rothschild and Sier Bank in 1987 with just 3 employees and €830,000 in capital. Guy de Rothschild died in Paris on June 12, 2007, aged 98, 11 years after Marie-Hélène. Marie-Hélène was not born a Rothschild. She was born Baroness Marie-Hélène Neyler, Stephanie Josina van Zuylen van Nievelt van der Haar in New York City on November 17, 1927. Her father was a Dutch diplomat and businessman. Her mother was born in Egypt to parents of Syrian immigrant origin. The family was multilingual, multicultural, and aristocratic, but not yet connected to the greatest banking dynasty in Europe. The Rothschild connection came through her paternal grandmother, Baroness Hélène de Rothschild, one of the more extraordinary women in the family's history. Hélène was the only child of Baron Salomon James de Rothschild, and she had been disinherited by her own mother for marrying a Roman Catholic. Despite the disinheritance, she had become the first woman ever to compete in an international motor race, the 1898 Paris-Amsterdam-Paris Trail, and had conducted a decades-long love affair with the poet René Vivien. The pattern of a Rothschild woman crossing religious lines, defying family convention, and rebuilding palatial properties would repeat almost exactly in Marie-Hélène's own life. She was educated at Marymount College in Tarrytown, New York, then went to Paris, where she entered the whirlwind of post-war high society. In 1950, she married Count François de Nicolet, a French horse breeder. They had one son, Philippe, who would go on to become a director of Paris Orléans, the Rothschild family's French investment vehicle, before the marriage dissolved in 1956. The following year, Marie-Hélène married Baron Guy de Rothschild in a ceremony in New York City. The union was historic on 2 counts. First, it was the first time a head of any Rothschild family, a dynasty that had maintained strict endogamy for over a century, had married a non-Jewish spouse. Guy felt compelled to resign his presidency of the Consistoire Central, the body representing French Jewry since 1905. Second, Marie-Hélène, as a Catholic, required a papal dispensation to annul her first marriage. Their son, Edward de Rothschild, was raised Jewish. What made Marie-Hélène legendary was not her bloodline or her marriage, but her talent for social choreography. After the couple reopened Ferrières in 1959, she personally supervised its refurbishment and transformed it into what one publication would later describe as a hedonist epicenter for European high society. Yves Saint Laurent sat beside Brigitte Bardot and Grace Kelly. Audrey Hepburn was a close personal friend. Salvador Dali became a regular fixture, treating the chateau with the proprietorial ease of a man who considered himself at home in any room magnificent enough to deserve him. She organised annual themed balls at Ferrières throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, each more elaborate than the last. These were not casual parties. They were fully produced theatrical events with dress codes, set designs and curated guest lists. Events so precisely constructed that their guest lists were instruments of social power. To receive an invitation was a confirmation of standing. To be omitted was a humiliation that circulated through European society for months. Such was the social terror these events inspired that, as contemporaries reported, one prominent socialite threatened to commit suicide if she was not invited to the next one. In 1971, she threw the Proust Ball to mark the centenary of Marcel Proust's birth, a full Edwardian cosplay event, with footmen carrying candelabras and Cecil Beaton on hand to photograph the proceedings. Marisa Berenson came as the Marchesa Luisa Casati stamper. It established that the Rothschilds had reached a level of thematic ambition with no peer in Europe, and it set the stage for what was coming. Beyond Ferrières, Marie-Hélène organised high-profile events in Paris and New York. In 1973, she helped bring together 5 French couturiers and 5 American designers for a fashion show at the Théâtre Gabriel in the Palace of Versailles. The event now known as the Battle of Versailles, a watershed moment in fashion history that launched American designers onto the international stage. She was awarded the Légion d'honneur for her contributions to promoting French culture internationally. She died on March 1, 1996, aged 68, after more than a decade battling cancer and crippling rheumatoid arthritis. Her Catholic funeral at the Church of Saint-Louis-en-l'Île in Paris was attended by former President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, Claude Pompidou, Bernadette Chirac, Gianni Agnelli, Alain Delon, and Yves Saint Laurent. She was buried at Arras de Moutry, the Rothschild horse farm in Normandy. Marie-Hélène and Guy did not invent the extravagant costume ball. They inherited a tradition that stretched back generations within the Rothschild family itself, within the broader ecosystem of Parisian high society hosts, and from a post-war culture that used lavish parties as declarations that civilization had survived. The Rothschilds had been hosting legendary events since the mid-19th century. Ferrières had been inaugurated with a gala for Napoleon III. Its hospitality was so famous that Bismarck had commandeered it during the Franco-Prussian War. Entertaining on a palatial scale was, quite literally, built into the family's architecture. More immediately, Marie-Hélène and Guy moved in a Parisian ecosystem of hosts and hostesses who treated party-giving as a competitive art form. Count Étienne de Beaumont, who had died in 1956, had hosted famous themed costume balls at his residence on Rue Masseron from the 1920s through the 1930s, commissioning avant-garde artists, including Picasso, Cocteau and Satie, to design sets, compose music, and choreograph dances for each event. His Soirée Babel in 1916 had been Picasso's introduction to this world. His balls were the forerunners of the art party fusion Marie-Hélène would perfect at an entirely different scale. Marie-Laure de Noailles, The Vicomtesse, whose mansion on Place des États-Unis and modernist villa in Hyères had been ground zero for Parisian surrealism, had funded Buñuel and Dali's L'Âge d'Or, Cocteau's The Blood of a Poet, and Man Ray's Les Mystères du Château de Dey. Her gatherings blurred the line between salon, party, and art exhibition. A model Marie-Hélène would scale up dramatically at Ferrières. De Noailles died in 1970, 2 years before the Surrealist Ball. Her death removed from Paris the single most intellectually radical social hostess of the century, leaving a vacancy that only the Rothschilds were positioned to fill. Elsa Maxwell, the Iowa-born hostess, who made a career organising parties for royalty and high society, despite having no money of her own, invented the scavenger hunt, organised the international motorboat races at Venice's Lido, and helped put Monte Carlo on the map as a tourist destination. She proved that a brilliant party was its own form of currency, a lesson Marie-Hélène understood instinctively. Maxwell died in 1963. Baron Alexis de Redé, the Vietnamese-born aesthete who lived in the Hôtel Lambert on the Île Saint-Louis, became Marie-Hélène's neighbour and closest social collaborator after the Rothschilds purchased the building's upper floors in 1975. Nancy Mitford described him as a tie-pin, thin, stiff and correct, with a weeny, immovable head on a long, stiff neck. His dinner parties, Jeanne Moreau opposite Salvador Dali, bumping elbows with Guy de Rothschild, were legendary in their intimacy. He fed directly into Marie-Hélène's social network and aesthetic sensibility, sharing with her a conviction that a great party was not a gathering of people in a room but the construction of a temporary world. What united all these figures, de Beaumont, de Noailles, Maxwell de Redé and the Rothschilds themselves, was a shared understanding that the social event had to justify its own existence through ambition. A mediocre party was not merely dull, it was a failure of nerve. Each of them operated in the knowledge that the previous generation had set a standard, and that the only acceptable response to that standard was to exceed it. The cumulative effect of this competitive escalation, each ball more extreme than the last, each theme more challenging, each guest list more demanding, was to raise the art form to a pitch that could only end in one way. There was nowhere left to go after Ferrières. The Surrealist Ball did not merely close an era, it exhausted one. The Surrealist Ball of 1972 did not emerge from nowhere. It was the culmination of a post-war tradition of spectacular themed balls, each one escalating the ambition, the spectacle, and the competition. The first truly grand social event of post-war Europe was Charles de Beistigui's Bal du Siècle, held on September 3, 1951, at Palazzo Labia in Venice. Beistegui was a half-Mexican, half-French millionaire whose fortune came from Mexican silver mines. He themed the evening after Tiepolo's fresco The Banquet of Cleopatra, which hung in the palazzo's own hall and invited over 1,000 guests. Venice was still on gas rations in 1951. England was still rationing food. Yet desperate Americans anchored their yachts at the Lido hoping for an invitation, and invitations had been sent 6 months in advance, specifically so that guests could commission elaborate costumes worthy of the occasion. Christian Dior attended in a costume designed by Salvador Dali. Dali wore a costume designed by Dior. Pierre Cardin designed costumes for more than 30 guests, an assignment that essentially launched his career as an international name. 70 footmen wore liveries sourced from the Duchess of Richmond's ball. The famous event held at Brussels on the eve of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, at which Wellington's officers had danced before riding out to fight Napoleon. The historical reference was deliberate. Beistegui was staging a party that claimed its place in the line of legendary European gatherings. Beistegui himself stood atop platform buskins that elevated him 2 feet above everyone else, wearing an 18th-century sausage-curl wig so that he could see and be seen throughout the night. Lady Diana Cooper was designated Cleopatra after so many women vied for the role that Beistegui had to settle it himself. The party raged until 6 in the morning. It set the post-war standard for competitive extravagance and established that the appetite for this kind of spectacle was not dead. It had merely been waiting for someone bold enough to revive it. 2 years later, the Marquis George de Cuevas, a Chilean-born ballet impresario married to Margaret Strong, granddaughter of John D. Rockefeller, mounted an even larger spectacle in Biarritz. 4,000 people were invited, 2,800 accepted. The theme was 18th century Grand Siècle, and the guest list included, by one count, 50 princes, 35 marquises, 95 counts, and 20 dukes. France was paralysed by a general strike at the time, and the Vatican's Osservatore Romano denounced the event as an insult to the misery and suffering of the populace. The hostile publicity did nothing. Everyone came anyway. Zizi Jeanmaire, the French starlet, entered the ball atop a camel. Pierre Balmain designed the Marquise's costume. Elsa Maxwell, who attended both the Bestegui and Cuevas parties, said of the latter that there were more people of authentic character, although you can't outshine a Venetian palace or people arriving in gondolas. Baron de Redé contributed 2 entries of his own to the lineage. His bal des têtes in June 1957 at the Hôtel Lambert had commissioned the young Yves Saint Laurent, then still working at the house of Christian Dior, to design the set and costumes, cementing the connection between haute couture and society party-giving that would define the next 2 decades. Saint Laurent later credited the commission as formative. Working for de Redé taught him that fashion was not merely clothing, but the construction of atmosphere. His Bal Oriental in December 1969, again at the Hôtel Lambert, was his masterpiece. The interior designer Valérien Ribard transformed the Hôtel Lambert into a non-specific Orientalist fantasy, with 2 enormous papier-mâché elephants standing in the courtyard. Hector Pascual designed automaton musicians for the Hercules Gallery, mechanical figures that played instruments without human hands, deepening the dreamlike quality of the evening. Pierre Cardin designed de Redé's own costume, a Mughal prince, executed in deep blue, one of Cardin's most celebrated costume commissions. The future Queen Margrethe II of Denmark and the Aga Khan attended. Brigitte Bardot was the closest thing to a swinging 60s presence. The Rolling Stones played Altamont the very next day, commonly cited as the end of the 1960s, and de Redé, as one critic noted, seemed unaware the decade had ever started. Then came Truman Capote's black and white ball at the Plaza Hotel in New York on November 28, 1966, the first truly modern society party and the one that broke the mould. For the first time, European aristocracy, American politicians, New York socialites, Hollywood stars, and working artists were jammed together in one room. Andy Warhol, Norman Mailer, Lauren Bacall, Frank Sinatra, and Mia Farrow, Gloria Vanderbilt, Leonard Bernstein, and Rose Kennedy all attended. The New York Times published the complete guest list, the first time it had done so for a party not held at the White House. The dress code was simple, black and white, with masks. What had been a closed ecosystem in Europe was now open, democratic, and thoroughly American. The Rothschilds took note. Marie-Hélène's Proust Ball in 1971, full Edwardian cosplay, Cecil Beaton photographs, footmen carrying candelabras, Marisa Berenson arriving as the Marchesa Luisa Casati Stampa, established that the Rothschilds had reached a level of thematic ambition with no peer in post-war Europe. It set the stage for what was coming. The disorientation began before anyone set foot in the chateau. Invitations to the Surrealist Ball were printed entirely in reverse, mirror image text, on a background of blue sky and clouds inspired by a painting by René Magritte. To read the card, a guest had to hold it up to a mirror. This was not merely a gimmick, it was a deliberate surrealist gesture, a signal that the evening would demand active participation in its own unreality. From the very first moment of contact, the rules of ordinary social life were suspended. The dress code was simple and provocative, black tie, long dresses, and surrealist heads. Every guest was expected to arrive not merely dressed up, but transformed. their heads replaced or obscured by elaborate surrealist headpieces, masks, and sculptural constructions. The guests themselves would become the artwork, making the ball a participatory performance as much as a dinner party. The theme was Surrealism, the early 20th century art movement launched by André Breton in the 1920s, which prized the irrational, the dreamlike, and the subversion of conventional reality. The driving creative force behind the concept was the Rothschilds' personal friendship with Salvador Dali, who served as a loose artistic director and contributed costume and set designs for the evening. Dali had been expelled from the official Surrealist movement in 1939, partly for being too politically right-wing, but his aesthetic and celebrity made him the natural collaborator for the Rothschilds' vision. The couple had been hosting themed annual balls at Ferrières almost every year since their 1957 marriage. The year before, in 1971, the theme had celebrated the centennial of Marcel Proust's birth, but 1972 was designed to surpass all of them, to be weirder, more theatrical, and more visually disorienting than anything before. As one publication noted at the time, funds were no constraint. Guests travelled along a dark forest road in the countryside east of Paris to reach the estate. As they emerged from the tree line and the chateau came into view, they were met with a startling illusion. The entire facade of Ferrières was bathed in moving orange and red gold floodlights, carefully engineered to give the impression that the palace was ablaze. On that cold December night, the chateau appeared to be on fire. Word had been passed that the Rothschilds' hunting hounds had been set loose in the grounds, a warning aimed at discouraging any uninvited photographers or gatecrashers from attempting to approach. The combination of the apparently burning palace and the sound of dogs in the dark ensured that guests arrived already unsettled, already stripped of the social confidence that normally attended their entrances into grand rooms. Once inside, guests found the main staircase lined with footmen in full livery, but these footmen were disguised as cats. Some meowed and pawed at the air, others had been staged in elaborate poses as if they had fallen asleep at various positions along the stairway. The effect was eerie and comic simultaneously, a living tableau that erased the line between servant and surrealist prop. The traditional hierarchy of the grand house, the butler, the footman, the ordered procession toward the dining room, had been deliberately subverted. Authority figures meowed. Beyond the staircase, guests did not proceed directly to the dining hall. Instead, they were funneled into a labyrinth, a maze constructed from black ribbons and lace, woven to resemble an enormous forest of cobwebs. The passage was described by some attendees as a hellish portal, full of dark surprises and disorienting dead ends. The space was deliberately claustrophobic and unsettling, a surrealist funhouse that forced even the most composed aristocrats into confusion and nervous laughter. If a guest became genuinely lost, they could call out for one of the cat servants, who would appear to rescue them and guide them through to the tapestry salon. The rescue itself was part of the performance. The interior of the chateau had been transformed with surrealist installations, shattered mirrors, mannequins posed in uncanny positions, abstract sculptures, and distorted reflections. Masks populated every room, worn by guests and mounted as decor, blurring the distinction between attendee and artwork. The red and gold lighting that had illuminated the exterior continued inside, casting an otherworldly amber glow over everything. By the time a guest finally reached the dining room, they had been systematically stripped of the familiar. They had decoded a mirror-written invitation, driven through dark woods, watched a palace appear to burn, been pawed at by sleeping cats, and fought their way through a web of black ribbons. Only then were they allowed to sit down and eat. Marie-Hélène de Rothschild greeted her guests at the far end of the tapestry salon, wearing a towering stag's head, enormous antlers rising above her evening gown, with pear-shaped diamond tears cascading down the mask's cheeks. The New York Times described her as a stag at the kill. The diamonds were real. Her husband, Guy de Rothschild, stood beside her wearing a fur hat topped with a headdress that represented a still life arrangement. A stuffed pheasant and a pheasant skeleton mounted on an enormous platter, as if he had walked out of a 17th century Dutch vanitas painting, one of those Baroque still-life canvases in which dead game birds and silver vessels and half-peeled fruit are arranged to remind the viewer that all abundance is temporary. Somewhere behind them, a concealed pianist played the compositions of Erik Satie, the French composer long associated with the Parisian avant-garde, creating an ambient, dreamlike soundtrack that guests could hear but could not locate. The music seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. It was a detail so precise in its surrealist intention that it could only have been conceived by a hostess who understood that great theatre is built from invisible architecture. Salvador Dali arrived in a wheelchair, flanked by his wife Gala and two nurses, his masseuse and his muse, Amanda Lear, one of whom was dressed in a jawbone. He carried a laser pointer in one hand and an automatically folding and unfolding umbrella in the other, both classic Dali props. Despite having contributed to the artistic direction of the ball and personally designed several of the guests' costumes, Dali himself refused to wear a costume. The implication was deliberate. Dali's own face, his waxed upturned moustache, his wide staring eyes, was already more surreal than any mask could be. He had been expelled from the Surrealist movement 33 years earlier, but he remained its most recognizable ambassador, a man whose appearance was itself a constant performance. At the Surrealist Ball, where every other guest had constructed an artificial face for the evening, Dali simply arrived as himself, and was the most surreal person in the room. Audrey Hepburn arrived in what became the single most reproduced image from the evening, a birdcage worn over her head. The cage was delicate and airy, enclosing her face and suggesting a bird trapped in gilded captivity, or perhaps the inverse, a woman choosing to wear her confinement as ornamentation. Various accounts describe the cage as containing small, sculptural birds or feathers. It was elegant rather than grotesque, and it remains the costume most frequently referenced in fashion editorials and recreations more than 50 years later. The image of Hepburn inside the cage has become one of the defining photographs of 20th century social life, more reproduced than almost any fashion photograph of the era, more cited than any red carpet image of its time. Baron Alexis de Redé wore one of the most complex headpieces of the night, a quadruple-decker construction of 4 faces stacked one above another, freckled with scarab beetles. The design was an Egyptian-inflected twist on Titian's Renaissance painting Allegory of Prudence, which depicts 3 faces representing past, present and future. The mask was custom-made by Dali himself and reportedly incorporated inset portraits of Marie-Hélène de Rothschild, a gesture of tribute that collapsed the distinction between the guest's headpiece and the hostess's identity. De Redé later wrote a first-person account of the evening that became one of the primary source documents for the ball, a narrative so precise in its detail, the smell of the cobwebs, the sound of the unseen pianist, the texture of the fur plates, that it functions as the closest thing to a contemporaneous record of the evening that exists. The perfumer and socialite Hélène Rochaz wore a gramophone on her head, a fitted skull cap from which sprouted a Victrola-like horn that morphed into an arm, its index finger resting on a record needle. The headpiece was designed by Hector Pasquale, the same artist who had built the automaton musicians for de Redé's Bal Oriental 3 years earlier. The Rochaz gramophone sold at Julien's auctions in 2024 for $2,600. A relatively modest sum for one of the 20th century's most photographed party props, and a measure of how thoroughly the object had escaped its original context. She was photographed alongside the young writer and photographer François-Marie Bagnet, who was among the youngest guests of the evening. Brigitte Bardot attended, reportedly having been helped to prepare her costume by the surrealist artist Leonor Fini, a Spanish-Argentine painter who had been a fixture of the Parisian surrealist scene since the 1930s, and whose work was known for its erotic and fantastical imagery. That Bardot, already the most photographed woman in France, needed artistic guidance to produce a costume strange enough for this room speaks to the standard Marie-Hélène had set. Marissa Berenson wore an elaborate cage of her own, different in design from Hepburn's, more theatrical and enveloping, less ethereal and more architectural. Italian Princess Maria Gabriella di Savoia, daughter of the exiled King Umberto II of Italy, arrived on Dali's arm and was photographed seated beside him. A pairing that compressed into a single image the intersection of displaced royalty, commercial celebrity, and avant-garde art that defined Marie-Hélène's guest lists. The actress Jacqueline de Lubac came as René Magritte's The Son of Man, wearing a large green apple in front of her face, a direct recreation of the 1964 painting, which was only 8 years old at the time. Baroness Thyssen-Bornemisza appeared as a two-headed woman alongside Guy Bagueneau de Pouchesse. At least one guest wore a collage of chopped-up Mona Lisa fragments on their head, and another appeared to have been inspired by M.C. Escher's 1956 work Bond of Union. References to Magritte were everywhere. Bowler hats, floating apples, gas lamp imagery, making the Belgian painter arguably the most cited artist of the evening after Dali himself. Many guests also wore rhinoceros heads, grotesque animal masks, or sculptural constructions incorporating daggers, horns, and found objects. The sheer range of headpieces meant that the party was simultaneously a fashion show, a sculptural exhibition, and a live-action gallery of 20th century art references. No two guests had interpreted the dress code in the same way. That, too, was by design. The photographs that survive from the evening, and there are fewer than most people assume given the pains taken to exclude photographers, show a room in which the ordinary grammar of social life had been comprehensively disassembled. There was no simple way to tell, from looking at a guest's headpiece, whether its creator was Dali, Pasquale, a Parisian couturier, or the guests themselves working with materials purchased that afternoon. Some headpieces had clearly cost thousands of francs and months of planning. Others appeared improvised, assembled from objects that had been repurposed through an act of creative will on the day. The social levelling effect was total. An archduchess with a Dali-designed mask stood beside a socialite who had sewn her own, and neither was obviously more surreal than the other. Marie-Hélène had created a room in which the currency of rank, the dress, the jewels, the practiced social entrance, had been replaced by a single new currency: strangeness. In that room, on that night, the stranger you were willing to be, the better you fitted in. When dinner was announced, guests were given cards indicating the name of their assigned table. But the names were deliberately nonsensical, making it impossible to simply walk to the right place. The tables bore surrealist titles drawn from the movement's vocabulary: the table of dissection umbrella, erection machine, the table of the dethroned queens, the metaphysical perspective table, the table of the shoes fit to be tied, the soluble fish table, a reference to André Breton's 1924 book of automatic writing. Guests wandered in theatrical disarray, guided, or further confused, by butlers in top hats with carnations in their buttonholes, whose official task was to decode the puzzles and escort each guest to their seat. Once seated, the table itself was a work of surrealist art. Each tablecloth depicted a Magritte-style sky, clouds drifting across a blue background. At each place setting sat a fur-covered plate, a tactile absurdity that made the simple act of eating feel transgressive. In place of conventional place cards, each guest found their name written on a square of sky held between a pair of ruby-red lips, a direct reference to Dali's Mae West lip sofa. The bread rolls were pale blue, pain paint meaning painted bread, a pun because the two French words are pronounced identically. Each wine glass bore the label Vin Vain, vain wine, another homophonic wordplay. A bubble blower sat at each place setting, an unexplained toy that simply added to the dreamlike unreality of the meal. The centerpieces were different at each table, each inspired by a surrealist painter or poet. One table, called Eggs à la Florentine, featured a mound of cooked spinach pierced by the carcass of a giant bird, garnished with sculpted women's breasts. Others were decorated with taxidermied tortoises and deformed plastic dolls, some missing limbs, others arranged in disturbing poses, that served as perverse substitutes for flowers. Traditional forks had been replaced at some settings with dead fish. The food itself was traditional haute cuisine, luxurious and meticulously prepared. But every dish name on the printed menu was a surrealist pun, many of them multilingual. The courses included les choses dégoulinantes, the dripping things, beaucoup de bris pour rien, much brie about nothing, soupe extra lucide soup, imbroglio de cadavres exquis, a reference to the surrealist drawing game Cadavre exquis, Lady and Sir Loin, a bilingual meat pun, tubercules en folie, crazy tubers, pêches et chèvres hurlant de tristesse, peaches and goat cheese howling in sadness, and enfin, dessert de tartare, at last, dessert of the tartares. The final course was the night's most photographed food moment, a life-sized sugar sculpture of a nude woman lying on a bed of roses, presented as the communal dessert. It was a fitting end to a meal that had treated every element of dining: plates, cutlery, bread, wine labels, seating charts, and finally the dessert itself, as raw material for surrealist transformation. The Surrealist Ball of December 12, 1972, was not intended as a farewell, but that is what it became. 3 years later, in 1975, Guy and Marie-Hélène de Rothschild donated the Château de Ferrières and over 300 acres of surrounding land to the Chancellery of the Universities of Paris. The grandest private party venue in France, the palace Bismarck had commandeered, Napoleon III had inaugurated, and where Dali's cats had meowed on the staircase, was gone from the family's hands forever. The chateau today houses the Ferrières School of Gastronomy. The cobweb labyrinth was not rebuilt. The Rothschilds relocated their social life to the Hôtel Lambert on the Ile Saint-Louis in Paris, the 17th-century townhouse they had purchased in 1975, sharing it with their neighbour Baron Alexis de Redé. The Hôtel Lambert was magnificent. Voltaire had lived there. Its gallery was painted by Charles Lebrun. But it was not Ferrières. It could not hold 150 people in a cobweb forest with the exterior ablaze. The era of the full-scale chateau ball was architecturally impossible in a Paris apartment, however grand. The decisive blow to the Rothschilds' world came in 1981, when the newly elected socialist president François Mitterrand nationalised Banque Rothschild, along with most of France's private banking sector. Guy was devastated. In a front-page open letter to Le Monde, he wrote, "Juif sous Pétain, paria sous Mitterrand, cela suffit. A Jew under Pétain, a pariah under Mitterrand, that's enough." He moved temporarily to New York. "Nationalising us meant throwing the Rothschilds out of France," he told the press. "We are a family, not an impersonal corporation." The family that had defined French financial aristocracy for 150 years was, overnight, severed from its institutional base. Mitterrand's government followed the nationalisation with France's first direct annual wealth tax in 1982, the impôt sur les grandes fortunes, levied progressively on personal assets with a top rate of 1.5%. It was abolished by Chirac's right-wing government in 1987, then reintroduced in 1989 as the Impôt de solidarité sur la fortune, which would remain in force until 2017. The ISF was explicitly designed as a tool of redistribution, a tax on being visibly, accumulatively rich. The practical effect was not to bankrupt the aristocracy. The revenues were modest, roughly 1.5% of France's total tax receipts, but to change the calculus of display. A senator's report estimated that 843 people left France in 2006 alone because of the ISF taking an estimated €2.8 billion in assets with them. More importantly, the cultural message was unmistakable. Flaunting dynastic wealth in post-war democratic France was no longer just gauche, it was now taxable. Throwing a ball where you served blue bread on fur plates, while footmen dressed as cats meowed at your guests, became, in this climate, an invitation for political destruction. The Mitterrand years effectively ended the era in which a French family of great wealth could organise public spectacle without political consequence. The private ball had always depended on a social contract in which the display of wealth was accepted as a form of cultural patronage. Mitterrand's France had revoked that contract. There was no renegotiating it. Simultaneously, the physical privacy required for such events was evaporating. The word paparazzo entered the lexicon from Federico Fellini's 1960 film La Dolce Vita, in which a fictional photographer of that name relentlessly pursued Roman celebrities. By the late 1960s, the fiction had become reality. Ron Galella, later dubbed the godfather of US paparazzi culture, pioneered the art of the candid ambush photograph, shooting celebrities off guard at premieres, on sidewalks and outside restaurants. In 1972, the very same year as the Surrealist Ball, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis sued Galella in federal court for harassment, testifying that his behaviour left her terrified, frightened, anguished, and humiliated. She won a restraining order requiring him to stay at least 25 feet away. But the lawsuit only confirmed what was already obvious. The boundary between private life and public spectacle had collapsed entirely. A single long-lens photograph from outside the gates of Ferrières, leaked to Paris Match, could now define the narrative of an entire evening, and the host had no control over the framing. The Rothschilds had released their hunting hounds on the grounds during the Surrealist Ball to discourage exactly this kind of intrusion. It worked in 1972. It would not have worked in 1982. By the 1980s, the economics of celebrity photography had made paparazzi images so valuable that no number of dogs, hedges or security guards could guarantee the hermetic privacy that a ball like the Surrealist dinner required. The entire premise of these events, that 150 people could gather in extreme, bizarre, transgressive costumes and trust that the images would circulate only among friends, was technologically dead. A single photograph of Audrey Hepburn in her birdcage, leaked to a weekly magazine rather than shared among intimate acquaintances, would have transformed the evening from a private artwork into a news event. The moment an event becomes a news event, the host loses authorship. The narrative belongs to the photographer and the editor. The Rothschilds, who had built the Surrealist Ball on total control of every element of the guest experience, could not have operated under those conditions. No one could. The people who had sustained the tradition were also one by one disappearing. Count Etienne de Beaumont, whose jazz-age costume balls had helped invent the form, had died in 1956. Marie-Laure de Noailles, patron of Buñuel and Dali, and hostess of the most intellectually radical salons in Paris, died in 1970. Elsa Maxwell, the Iowa-born hostess who proved that a great party was its own form of social capital, died in 1963. Of the post-war generation, the Marquis Georges de Cuevas, whose 1953 Biarritz ball had drawn 2,800 guests and a Vatican denunciation, died in 1961. Charles de Baistegui, whose 1951 Venetian Bal du Siècle had launched the entire post-war tradition, died in 1970. Baron Alexis de Rede, who had thrown the Bal Oriental as recently as 1969, survived longer than most. He died in 2004. But his final decades were spent as a recluse in the Hôtel Lambert, entertaining intimate dinner parties of 8 rather than costume balls of hundreds. Marie-Hélène herself battled cancer and crippling rheumatoid arthritis throughout the 1980s and died on March 1, 1996, aged 68. Nobody replaced them. This was not an accident. The grand-themed ball required a very specific and historically contingent combination of attributes in its host. inherited or married wealth on a scale sufficient to fund a production budget equivalent to a small film, a private property large enough to serve as a stage, the social authority to command attendance from people who themselves had better things to do. Genuine aesthetic taste and creative vision, Marie-Hélène was not hiring an events company, she was the events company, and the cultural confidence to spend lavishly in public without apology. By the 1980s, every single one of these conditions had eroded. Wealth was increasingly corporate rather than dynastic. The new rich of the 1980s were hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs, and leveraged buyout specialists, people whose fortunes were large, but whose social authority derived from financial performance rather than inherited position. They could buy Ferrières. They could not be Ferrières. The thing that made Marie-Hélène's balls work was not the money. It was the unquestioned right to determine who mattered. That right cannot be purchased. It accumulates over generations and evaporates in a decade. Properties had been donated, sold or converted to museums. Social authority had fragmented across media, politics and entertainment. And the cultural confidence to throw a ball where dead fish replaced forks and mannequin corpses served as dessert plates was simply unthinkable in an era of tabloid exposure and redistributive taxation. What replaced the grand private ball was the corporate-sponsored charity gala, a fundamentally different organism wearing the same costume. Where Marie-Hélène's Surrealist Ball was funded by one family, designed by one creative vision, and attended by one curated guest list of personal friends, the modern gala is funded by brands, designed by events companies, and attended by whoever the sponsor decides will generate the most media coverage. The host is no longer an individual with taste. The host is a corporation with a marketing budget. The key transitional institution, the bridge between the world of Ferrières and the world we live in now, was the Met Gala, the annual fundraising benefit for the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The Costume Institute itself began in 1937, when the philanthropist Irene Lewisone founded the Museum of Costume Art in New York. In 1946, the collection merged with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, with an unusual structural catch. It would be the only department in the entire Met that had to finance its own operations through external fundraising, independent of the museum's general budget. This structural quirk would shape everything that followed. In 1948, the fashion publicist Eleanor Lambert, the same woman who created New York Fashion Week, the International Best Dressed List, and the Council of Fashion Designers of America, organized the first Costume Institute benefit. It was an invitation-only midnight supper held at various New York venues, including the Waldorf Astoria, Central Park, and the Rainbow Room, with tickets priced at $50 per person. The guest list was composed primarily of New York Society members and fashion industry figures. No celebrities, no grand names, no red carpet. Lambert ran the event for the next 20 years. For 2 decades, the Costume Institute benefit was considered, in the words of the institution's own historians, simply one of many annual benefits held for New York charitable institutions. Respectable, unremarkable, and invisible outside the fashion trade. The metamorphosis began in 1972, the very same year Marie-Hélène de Rothschild hosted her Surrealist Ball, when the Met's director Thomas Hoving appointed Diana Vreeland as special consultant to the Costume Institute. Vreeland had just been fired from Vogue, where she had served as editor-in-chief since 1963. She was 69 years old, jobless, and in need of reinvention. What Vreeland did was essentially import the ethos of the Parisian costume ball into an American museum setting. She imported the theatrical themes, the visual excess, the celebrity guest lists, the willful prioritizing of glamour over scholarly rigor. Before Vreeland, the Costume Institute's exhibitions had been quiet, antiquarian affairs. After Vreeland, everything changed. Her first exhibition, The World of Balenciaga, in 1973, was an immediate sensation. She staged it not as an academic retrospective, but as a spectacle. Headless mannequins posed dramatically against glossy magenta walls, surrounded by props including elephants and carriages. Purists were horrified. Audiences came in record numbers. The art critic John Heilpern wrote, "One day the god of the temple of Dendur will cry, 'I am not on earth to share a museum with a bunch of fashion freaks.'" But the curators who worked with Vreeland conceded that her instincts were rarely wrong. Vreeland produced 12 exhibitions between 1973 and 1984, including The Glory of Russian Costume in 1976, Vanity Fair, A Treasure Trove in 1977, The Manchu Dragon, Costumes of China in 1980, and Yves Saint Laurent, 25 Years of Design in 1983, each one more theatrical than the last. She brought the gala itself on site to the museum, introduced themes tied to each exhibition, and personally expanded the guest list to include Hollywood. Elizabeth Taylor, Cher, Andy Warhol, Bianca Jagger, and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis all became Met Gala regulars during the Vreeland era. The gala moved from being a trade dinner to being the party of the year. Vreeland served as consultant until her death in 1989. She was the critical link between the Parisian tradition of de Beaumont, de Noailles, and de Rothschild, and the American institution that would eventually supersede it. She had spent her career at Harper's Bazaar and Vogue, covering the very hostesses whose balls she was now, in effect, replicating inside a museum. The difference was that Vreeland's version was open to the public, ticketed, and required to generate revenue. The hospitality had become a product. The guest list had become a policy. The evening that Marie-Hélène had built as an act of private artistic will was being rebuilt in New York as an institutional fundraising mechanism. And in that rebuilding, something essential was already being lost, even if nobody had yet named it. After Vreeland's death, the real transformation came in 1995, when Vogue editor-in-chief Anna Wintour served as chairperson for the first time. She chaired again in 1997, and by 1999 had become the permanent chairperson, a role she has held for over a quarter century. Wintour did not merely continue Vreeland's work, she corporatized it entirely. Under her leadership, the Met Gala was transformed from a social event that happened to raise money into a financial engine that happens to be a social event. The changes were structural, comprehensive, and irreversible. The guest list became a media portfolio. Wintour personally approves every single attendee, much as Marie-Hélène controlled her lists at Ferrières. But where Marie-Hélène invited personal friends and people she found interesting, Wintour's list is curated to mirror the pages of Vogue, a mix calculated for maximum media coverage across fashion, entertainment, business, sports, and politics. As the New York Times chief fashion critic Vanessa Friedman noted, the guest list that she curates, because it is an entirely curated guest list, is like nothing else. Themed costumes became content triggers. Guests are expected to dress to the annual theme: Camp, Notes on Fashion in 2019, Heavenly Bodies, Fashion and the Catholic Imagination in 2018, China, Through the Looking Glass in 2015, echoing the tradition of surrealist heads or Proustian cosplay at Ferrières. But where the Surrealist Ball's costumes were private performances for 150 friends, Met Gala costumes are public performances for a global audience of millions, designed primarily to generate social media impressions. Escalating spectacle became the norm. Jared Leto carried a replica of his own severed head in 2019. Katy Perry dressed as a chandelier the same year. Lady Gaga performed 4 consecutive outfit reveals on the red carpet. Rihanna arrived in a papal mitre and jewelled robe for Heavenly Bodies. The theatrical ambition is comparable to Dali arriving in a wheelchair with a laser pointer, but Dali did it for 150 people in a private home. These performers do it for more than 200 credentialed photographers and a global live stream. Ticket prices told the story of the transformation in a single data series. Individual tickets rose from $50 in 1948 to $2,000 in 1998, to $30,000 in 2014 to $50,000 in 2023, to $75,000 in 2024. Tables of 10 start at $350,000. These prices are almost never paid by the celebrity attendees themselves. They are paid by the fashion brands who dress them, fly them to New York, house them at the Mark Hotel or the Carlyle, and in some cases create entirely separate custom outfits for the after-parties. Loewe's estimated sponsorship for the 2024 gala was roughly $2 million, working out to approximately $250,000 per attendee when all costs were included. The attendee is not the customer, the attendee is the product. The fundraising numbers reflect the industrial scale. The 2025 Met Gala raised a record $31 million in a single night, the highest gross in the event's 77-year history. Since Winter assumed the chairmanship, total contributions to the Costume Institute have surpassed $200 million. In 2014, the Met renamed the department the Anna Wintour Costume Centre in her honour, a tribute that effectively branded a museum wing after its chief fundraiser. The media value dwarfed the ticket revenue. In 2023, data company Launchmetrics calculated that the Met Gala generated nearly $1 billion in media impact value for participating brands, almost double the Super Bowl. By 2025, the figure had ballooned to a record-breaking $1.3 billion in earned media value, with 2,700 profiles generating 16,700 pieces of content that received 866 million engagements. Louis Vuitton alone, as official sponsor, captured $154 million in earned media value. Marc Jacobs earned $95 million, largely off Rihanna's viral pregnancy announcement. The Met Gala is not a party that happens to generate media coverage. It is a media event that happens to be formatted as a party. There is one rule at the Met Gala that more than any other reveals the distance between Anna Wintour's world and Marie-Hélène de Rothschild's. There is a strict social media ban inside the event. Once guests pass the red carpet and enter the museum, they are technically prohibited from posting on any platform. The ostensible purpose is to preserve the event's exclusivity and mystique. Consider the absurdity of this rule in historical context. At the Surrealist Ball, there was no social media ban because there was no social media. There were barely any cameras. The few photographs that exist emerged slowly, shared among friends, and took years to enter wider circulation. The privacy was organic, structural, and total. The Rothschilds released their hunting hounds on the grounds to keep photographers at bay, and it worked. The images from the evening that survive today are remarkable partly because of how few there are, and partly because they feel stolen from another world. At the Met Gala, the privacy has to be enforced by corporate policy, and it barely works. Guests routinely violate the ban. The most famous Met Gala image of the 2010s was Kylie Jenner's bathroom selfie, taken in flagrant violation of the rule. The ban is a nostalgic gesture toward a world that no longer exists, a simulation of the intimacy that Marie-Hélène's guests experienced effortlessly by virtue of being in a private home in the French countryside in December with no one watching. The Met Gala has the costumes, it has the themes, it has the guest list drama and the aesthetic ambition. What it does not have, what it structurally cannot have, is the privacy, the intimacy, the creative coherence and the sheer strangeness that came from the event being hosted in someone's home by someone who was also the creative director, for guests who were also personal friends, with no cameras allowed, no sponsors to appease and no global audience to perform for. At the Surrealist Ball you fought through a cobweb labyrinth while cat servants meowed at you, sat down to a meal where the bread was blue and the forks were dead fish, and looked across the table at a woman wearing a gramophone on her head, while an unseen pianist played Eric Satie somewhere in the room you could not find. You were not performing for anyone outside that chateau. There was no outside. At the Met Gala you walk up a staircase, pose for more than 200 photographers, eat a corporate-catered dinner, and check your phone. The spectacle has been preserved. The surrealism has not. The economics tell the story in a single number. Marie-Hélène de Rothschild spent her own money to create an evening that generated zero revenue and zero media impressions. Anna Wintour's 2025 Met Gala raised $31 million in ticket sales and generated $1.3 billion in media impact value for the brands that paid to participate. One event was an artwork. The other is an industry. Marie-Hélène de Rothschild threw her last great party at Ferrières in 1972 and donated the château 3 years later. Anna Wintour has chaired or co-chaired the Met Gala every year since 1995. One woman hosted an evening, the other administers an institution. The grand private ball did not simply end. It was absorbed, professionalized, corporatized, and broadcast. What was once a night of private surrealist delirium for 150 friends is now a $75,000 a ticket content generation event for strangers, live-streamed to millions, sponsored by fashion conglomerates, and dissected on TikTok before the first course is served. Consider the full arc. In 1951, Charles de Bestegui spent his own silver mine fortune to throw a party for 1,000 people in a Venetian palazzo and asked nothing in return except the pleasure of having done it. In 1953, the Marquis de Cuevas drew 2,800 guests to Biarritz and endured a Vatican denunciation without flinching. In 1972, Marie-Hélène de Rothschild surrounded her chateau in artificial fire, released her hunting dogs on the photographers, made her guests fight through a cobweb labyrinth, and served them dinner on fur plates with dead fish for forks. All of it at their own expense for their own guests on their own terms. In 2025, the Met Gala raised $31 million and generated $1.3 billion in media impact value for corporate sponsors. It is not that the ambition diminished. It is that ambition is no longer the point. Revenue is the point. The party is the invoice. The Surrealist Ball was the last time the old world threw a party on its own terms. Everything since has been a negotiation with the new one. With that said, we'd love to see you in the comments. Before this video, were you aware of the extensive and wild history of not only the Rothschild Ball, but the many balls that came after it? Who can claim the Rothschild Ball was a key influence? We look forward to hearing from you below, and thanks for joining us for another episode.